So I'd like for us to welcome our next speaker. Her name is Aiko Kojima. She's a PhD candidate in sociology here at the University of Chicago and a senior visiting researcher at the Keio Institute. Her research interests include food and diet, nationalism, culture, political sociology, and consumption studies. She's currently working on her dissertation project on nationalism and consumerism in food movements in Japan. She is a member of the Atomic Age Project that aims to cultivate critical and reflective intervention regarding nuclear power and weapons. Please welcome Aiko Kojima.
Thank you very much for coming. So first, please watch this. It's going to be like 1 minute. And I want you to see this time frame. The old circles show the earthquake, the strength, magnitude. Yes, the color shows the quake depth, and the diameter shows the magnitude. This is just the March 11th, just one day, the March 11th. So it was 2 years and 4 months ago, March 11th, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., magnitude 9.0 earthquake, the strongest ever recorded in Japan, hit the East Japan. And 40 minutes later, the tsunami arrived at Tohoku shore. Its estimated wave height reached up to 128 feet. Ships, cars, houses, buildings, the entire cities were gone with many, many lives. More than 50,000 people died, and almost 3,000 people are still missing. It was the most devastating catastrophe in history. But I have to be accurate. It was the most devastating catastrophe visible in history. About 5 hours later from the earthquake, it is estimated that nuclear meltdown occurred in #1 reactor in Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Nuclear meltdown means the core of nuclear reactor, namely nuclear fuels, melt like lava, and it is also estimated that meltdown occurred about 80 hours later from the earthquake in #2 and #3 reactors, and liquefied nuclear fuel in 3 reactors breached the inner containment vessels, namely melt-through, or so-called China syndrome. But all of these are estimation. Nobody did not and will not see the real damage. Where the melted fuel rods currently is. Because of enormous radiation, no human beings can go inside of the containment vessels. Tokyo Electric Company, TEPCO, the operator of Fukushima Daiichi, has tried to see inside using a camera twice. but the image was highly noised due to the massive nuclear fission inside. Because of unexpected debris and obstacles inside, they lost control of the cable attached to the camera. And both times, the camera couldn't reach to the bottom of the vessel. It was the most devastating catastrophe invisible, and it's still ongoing. Without knowing where the melted fuel is, they have to keep pouring water into the containment vessels to cool the fuel and fission products. However, because the vessels are damaged and circulation system is temporary, poured water keeps leaking as massively radioactive water, part of which runs into groundwater, and it's supposed to leak into the ocean. Contaminated water increased 100,000 gallons every day. Now in Fukushima Daiichi, there is over 100 million gallons of contained water. The emission of radioactive material to the environment is estimated 900 quadrillion becquerel only in March 2011, and it still keeps leaking. We don't know how much the total emission will be in the end. Just for comparison, the total emission at Chernobyl accident is estimated as 5,200 quadrillion becquerel. So what we could see was hydrogen air explosions of 3 reactors, actually 2 reactors. But what we saw with our eyes was water vapors and black smoke. We could not see the radioactive materials released into the environment. We can see ghost town in the evacuated zone, but we cannot see radioactive particles spread in the town. We can see tremendous amounts of tanks that contain contaminated water. Just to see, this is human. This is a worker of Fukushima Daiichi, and these are all tanks contained leaking contaminated water. But we cannot see radioactivity of water. Radiation is invisible. It does not have smell. It does not make noise. With our 5 senses, we cannot perceive its existence. So how much radiation is dangerous? How much it affects on human health? There is not an easy answer for this question. We first need to differentiate high-level exposure and low-level exposure. Here is a simple chart showing the radiation dose and its health effect. As you see, 50 millisievert or 5 rem is the lowest dose whose health risk is statistically proven. That means, as for effects of radiation exposure below this level, there is not agreement among scientists. Some claims it does not affect human health, or its effect is negligible. There are even few claiming that low-dose exposure has positive effects because it stimulates cellular repairs. This line. It is called radiation hormesis hypothesis. But majority of science are agreeing that this line, agreeing that it is rational to assume that cancer risk is directly proportional to the dose. So namely, no matter how small the dose is, radiation exposure does affect human health. This model is called linear no threshold model, LNT, and employed by International Commission on Radiation Protection, the US National Academy of Science, the US National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, and so forth. But I would like to emphasize that this whole debate is only about cancer risk. It has been reported that Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors have been suffering from indefinite complaints such as fatigue, nose bleeding, nausea, high blood pressure, insomnia, memory loss, weak immune system, and so forth. And these chronic malconditions observed among atomic bomb survivors were named Bura Bura syndrome by people, which imply that A-bomb survivors were lazy despite that no abnormalities were found in medical check. Dr. Shuntaro Hira, he himself is a Hiroshima survivor, had seen over 6,000 atomic bomb survivors and clinically researched Bura Bura syndrome. Here I have to mention about another basic knowledge of radiation exposure. You may have heard experts saying such things like, if you flew round trip from New York to Tokyo, you would absorb about 0.2 millisievert radiation. Or chest X-ray delivers 0.05 millisievert and CAT scan 6.9 millisievert radiation. Or we are already exposed to natural radiation every day. Global average is 2.4 millisievert yearly, of which half comes from radon in air. Therefore, you do not have to worry too much about radiation level in Tokyo, which reads less than 0.5 microsievert. In other words, 0.0001 millisievert. Even about radiation level in many Fukushima cities, which reads between 0.1 and 0.4 microsievert, or 0.0001 and 0.0004 millisievert. But first of all, according to LNT model, as I explained, no matter how small the dosage, it is health risk. If we are already exposed to natural radiation, which is given, why it is okay to be exposed to more radiation? Radiation exposure accumulates. If we are exposed to 2.4 millisievert natural radiation, besides that 2.4, we will be exposed to man-made radiation from medical source, nuclear plants, fallout from nuclear weapons testing. All these combine and push up our risk level. Moreover, such comparison to underestimate the effect of nuclear power plant accident is highly misleading for two reasons. First, these claims ignore the period of time to be exposed. Those of X-ray and CAT scan are indeed high, but its period of time is less than a minute, even less than a second. On the other hand, those monitor readings in Tokyo or many other cities in Japan now are usually expressed with a unit, microsievert per hour. So if it reads 0.1 microsievert per hour, yearly exposure is estimated 0.8 millisievert. Living in contaminated area, If not, the contamination is relatively moderate. It's a completely different thing from taking one-time momentary shot of X-ray. Second, this comparison talks solely about external exposure. But what becomes more serious and long-term hazard in nuclear accident is actually internal exposure. So suppose there is burning charcoals. From charcoal, you will feel heat. This is external exposure. And it is expressed with the unit of C-volt, rem, or gray. Heat you feel depends on the temperature of source charcoal, the period of time you are exposed, and the distance from the charcoal. It can be also shaded to some extent by using paper or the panels. On the other hand, if you accidentally swallow a particle of burning charcoal, this is internal exposure. So that particle keeps burning inside your body. This, namely, you will be exposed to the radiation continuously from almost zero distance, and there is no way of escaping from it. Therefore, for internal exposure, the amount of radioactivity there, which is expressed with the unit of becquerel, becomes the problem. Internal exposure occurs through inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact. If you have a cut or wounds, it can come in through your skin. Radioactive material entered inside a body accumulates different parts of body depending on kind of nuclide. For example, iodine will accumulate in the thyroid gland, cesium in muscle and reproductive organ, and strontium in bones. And number in brackets in this picture shows the biological half-life of each nuclide. The first half-life is the time required for the amount of radioactive atom to become half of the original. So radioactivity falls exponentially. So here is the movie to show the image, how the radioactivity is reduced. And this curve shows this is the time, and this is the amount, the vertical axis is the time, amount of the radioactivity, and horizontal shows the time. And on your left, that red dot is a radioactive particle, atoms. And when it decays, it becomes not radioactive, and it will become green. So please watch how it goes. Oops. And the upper bar shows one half-life. So when one half-life ends, the number of atoms become the half. And the second half-life, another half. So if there is 100 becquerels of nuclide A, whose half-life is 1 year, in the first year, 50 atoms are expected to decay and become non-radioactive. And the radioactivity will be 50 becquerels. In the second year, 25 will decay, and the radioactivity will be 25 becquerels. In the third year, it will be 12 becquerels, and in the fourth year, 6 becquerels. So half-life doesn't mean if you multiply it by 2, the total amount will be completely gone. It's not like that. This follows the exponential curve. So it takes half, almost eternal. So, but this number shows not a half-life, but it shows biological half-life, which means radionuclide entered in the body will be excreted through metabolism. So combining the natural decay factor and the metabolism factor, biological half-lives show the expected period of time that the amount of radioactivity in the body will be reduced to the half of the original amount. So in case of iodine, its decay factor, the half-life was 8 days. But because it is too short, metabolism factor doesn't affect that much. So in 7 days, half of the original iodine will be out from your body. And cesium half-life is almost 2 years, but combining with metabolism effect is going to be 100 to 200 days. On the other hand, strontium, it has a half-life of 28 years. It has the biological half-life almost 18 years. This is because strontium accumulates in bone, and bone, what accumulates in bone is hard to be excreted. It's hard to be put into the blood and go to the bladder and out as a urine. So that's why it takes longer. So what exactly the radiation do to our body? In a nutshell, it damages our DNA. So every single cell of the human body has DNA. The DNA is double-stranded helices. When a radionuclide decays, it emits radiation. And this radiation cuts through DNA. Damaged DNA will repair itself, but in this process, if an error occurs, that can lead to DNA abnormalities, cancer, and other disease. Even more hazardous is the case that DNA damage occurs during cell division. During cell division, DNA splits and becomes 2 single strands, and each strand replicate another strand. So if DNA is damaged during it is split, the chance of error occurs during repair becomes high. So that is the reason why children are much more vulnerable to radiation exposure than adults, because their cell division is very active. So now you may feel you are listening to some medical or physics lecture. But I am not a medical expert. I'm not a nuclear physics scientist either. But I'm telling you, this is the knowledge many of people in Japan now have. You need to know these things in order to protect yourself and your family. That is how it is, eating in post-Fukushima, post-nuclear accident world. So consumers, especially mothers of young children, are desperately learning about radiation. But you cannot protect yourself just with the knowledge, because radiation is invisible. No matter how well you understand the risk of radiation exposure, your senses don't tell you whether radioactive fallouts are there in a sandbox in a playground, whether this milk, this bowl of rice, or this blueberry is contaminated. These pictures were drawn by an artist, Misao Yugi. She has drawn a series of the red dot pictures in hoping that they would help to imagine the existence of radioactive particles in daily life by artistically make them visible. These pictures can be downloaded for free and are used widely, particularly in activism of young mothers. But it is still imagination. In reality, you want to know whether this specific milk is okay or not. Thus, in order to know the level of contamination for sure, monitoring with special device is necessary. On March 17, 2011, the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare announced that thereafter they would monitor the radiation level of food and set restrictions on shipment and on intake. The standards employed then was the guideline issued by Nuclear Safety Commission in previous year, because until then, in Japan, there did not exist the legal standards regarding radiation level of food. According to this standard, the government conducted sample monitoring, and if given item did not exceed the defined level, allowed it to be sipped and eaten as safe. But for consumers, this standard was pretty much questionable. First, even though there had not existed the legal standards, there had been several criteria in Japan, and comparing to those pre-existing criteria, newly set limits were too high. For example, since the Chernobyl accident, Japan had been banning the import of foods whose radioactive cesium level exceeded 370 becquerel per kilogram. However, a new limit was set as 500 becquerel per kilogram. This is actually more hazardous than the simple difference of two numbers. For usually, the limits for imported foods would be higher than domestic foods, as in many of European countries after Chernobyl. Because the ratio of imported food in total food consumption is smaller than the ratio of domestic food consumption. So imported production factor IPF of 0.1 was employed by International Food Standards Codex in WHO and FAO. In a nutshell, what this means is, it can be supposed that of all foods consumed in a given country, food imported from radiation-contaminated area would be only 10%. Thus, it would be okay if a radiation limit for imported food is relatively higher. For people in that country, even if he is relatively highly contaminated food from affected area, because its amount would be small, its effect is supposed to be limited. To put this in another way, in case of living in affected area, he is supposed to take contaminated food continuously and in large amount. Thus, the limit of radiation level of each item should be set low. Another example is drinking water. Until March 17th, Japan had been following the WHO standards in which the level of iodine 131 and cesium 137 should have not exceeded 10 becquerel per liter. But after the employment of new standards, its accepted level became 300 for iodine and 200 for cesium. Also, the monitoring method was not assuring for consumers. The government monitoring was sample monitoring. Thus, not all single items were not tested. Also, it was pass-fail method. Namely, the government tested only whether it exceeded the limit or not. So food that did not exceed the limit was defined as just safe, whether its radiation level was 499 or 0. It's all equally just safe. Thus, there was no way for consumers to know how much exactly a given item was contaminated or not. So facing with such food monitoring system, what consumers did? Some consumers did not question about it and kept living as they used to. And I have to say there are many. They went to grocery stores and bought whatever foods they liked, because the government authorized that all food on market were safe. But there were also some consumers who did not trust the governmental safety standard. Without any specific monitoring information, what those people first did was to shun foods produced in Fukushima and East Japan. Because Japan archipelago stretches northeast to southwest, and fallout effects were supposed to be minor in west regions. This region. People sought for producers from west. As a result, price of producers from east severely collapsed. That put farmers who had been already suffering from the devastating earthquake and tsunami in even tougher situation. East Japan is a major agricultural area, particularly of rice. Sanriku Coast, this Pacific Ocean coast. Sanriku Coast, which was devastatingly engulfed by tsunami, is a great fishing ground and also known for its high-quality seaweeds. So consumers' sudden avoidance of food from east seriously affected farmers and fishermen's economic situation. For farmers and fishermen, as long as it passed the sample test, they could ship their products because they were supposed to be safe. But consumers didn't think those supposedly safe food were really safe. In catch-22 situation, one concept came to emerge. It is called Fushou Higai. Fushou means rumor or reputation, and Higai means damage. Combined, it means a financial damage caused by rumor. But it came to signify more specifically East Japan farmers and fishermen's financial difficulties because of consumers' shunning of their products. This term came to be used to address the sympathy for farmers and fishermen. But it also suggests that it is a consumer's overreaction. Consumers should not be unreasonable to avoid those foods, given that their radiation level is below the limit that's safe. In the context in which Fushou Higai is used, it is also encouraged for consumers to willingly purchase foods from affected area. The slogan was support farmers, fishermen, or East Japan, support by eating. Here, I would like to call your attention to a question. Who preferred the concept of Fushou Higai? Some farmers and fishermen in difficulty understandably did. They earnestly followed the official order and just did their job, producing and shipping safe foods. For them, consumers' behavior would have appeared irrational and egoistic. But there were more who preferred this concept. It was the government and the nuclear power supporters. Why did they? because idea of Fusho-higai can save them from taking the fundamental responsibility to compensate farmers and fishermen for their financial loss. First and foremost, it was because of nuclear accident that food from East could not sell. To this extent, those are accountable for farmers and fishermen's difficulty are TEPCO. And the government, which had been promoting nuclear power despite of high risk. If a certain food was contaminated, if not at the level exceeding 500 becquerel, and it didn't sell, it is not a damage caused by a rumor, but it is a real damage. In Fusho-higai argument, it is often portrayed as the conflict between consumers' interest and producers' interest. But we have to be aware that to whose interest it serves the most. I also would like to point that while Fusho-higai argument often appears as if it cares about farmers and fishermen's well-being, it is highly deceptive. By defining a food whose contamination level is below 500 becquerel as safe, it practically declares that the land and the sea in which that food is produced is okay environment for farmers and fishermen to work. For example, at the point of April 2011, the government estimated that rice crop would absorb 10% of radioactive substance in soil. Therefore, the restriction standards to plant rice was announced that soil contamination level should not exceed 5,000 becquerel per kilo. Namely, farmers were allowed to work on soil with 5,000 becquerel radiation almost every day for 160 days from planting to cropping because crops grown on that soil were expected to be safe. It completely neglected farmers' health risk. Continuous direct contacts with contaminated soil and continuous inhalation of contaminated dust cause serious health hazards for farmers. So to cope up with such precarious and frustrating situation, consumers started acting. First, consumers demanded thorough monitoring and information disclosure. So did some farmers. This is a contour map of air radiation dose. As you see, radioactive particle from Fukushima Daiichi spread it on the wind. Thus, it did not spread concentrically. So even in East Japan, there are areas which had not been affected so much. For farmers in those areas, consumers' sending of entire Eastern products were actually a Fusho-higai. So for them, thorough monitoring would be beneficial by proving their product safety. So in 3 months since the Fukushima tragedy, major organic delivery services started their own monitoring and set their own standards, which were way much stricter than the government. For example, one company do not sell food whose radiation level exceeded 1 becquerel per kilo. Another company also monitors every item and set their standard. For items with baby label, it shouldn't exceed 10 becquerel per kilo. For other items, it shouldn't exceed 100 becquerel, but all monitoring data are disclosed on their website. There is also another company that did monitoring and standard setting likewise, but also created a separate course for the senior adult members who are in general less vulnerable to radiation exposure. And that course consists of produces specifically from Fukushima and surrounding area. So because children cannot take it, willing senior adults would take it to support farmers. That was the idea of that company. So number of members of this kind of delivery service have been expanding, especially among households with small children. But the problem is they are expensive. They are expensive. So it leads to a class issue. If you can afford, you can buy safe foods. But if you cannot afford, you have to accept the governmental standard and go to the regular grocery stores. And to this extent, I think it is similar to genetically modified organs problem in the States. While GMOs present in 75 to 80% of conventional processed food in the US, currently in the States, there is practically no regulation regarding GMO usage in food and no requirement of labeling. But USDA organic standard prohibits the use of GMO. So if you want to avoid GMO, there is no other way to buy the organics, which is, as you know, expensive. So radiation-free food business in Japan and current GMO problems in the US are common in terms of which both are grounded on the inequality of food safety. Another attempt to co-op with food radiation, which is less consumerist, is citizens' radioactive measuring stations. It is run by shareholding citizens in each local communities. There are over 100 of such stations from Hokkaido to Okinawa in Japan. Each station is independent. Thus, the ways of management are different, but those stations make a network. In many cases, a station purchased a special device for food radioactivity measuring that can cost between about $10,000 and $150,000 by donation or members' share. And anybody can bring in food to be monitored by paying fees. If the device was purchased by members' share, usually members receive a discount. It is non-profit and democratic attempt. But even though there are over 100, the number of stations is far less enough for people to use every day. Also, management can be a problem in some stations. If you could manage to eliminate unsafe food from your family table by avoiding produces from affected area, or through safe food business, or by using citizen measuring stations, it is not enough to protect your child. There is a critical occasion every day for children, which your own financial ability, efforts, awareness can do nothing for. It is school lunch. 99% of elementary students and 93% of middle students go to public school in Japan. And almost 100% of public elementary schools and 80% of public middle schools provide school lunch. And unlike in the US, it is not a cafeteria style. So you do not choose what you eat. Everyone eats the same menu. Namely, school lunch is in completely egalitarian public sphere, and there is no room for personal choice, and therefore there is no room for personal responsibility principle. So when you are worried about radioactive contamination of food provided in school lunch, you cannot resolve it by individualism or consumerism. There is no other way than you act socially and politically. That is why I think from the relatively early stage, radiation contamination of food have been understood as a social problem, at least among parents of young children, and the importance and the need of social action have been recognized. School lunch is administered by educational board in each local government. Thus, the response towards radiation contamination the response towards the radiation contamination of food varied very much depending on the local body. Because of official local production, because of official local production, local consumption principle pre-existed, it was particularly keen concern for families in affected area. It was probably the first case nationally reported that city of Matsumoto in Nagano Prefecture announced zero internal exposure policy. For this announcement to be made, the influence of Mayor Sugenoya was significant. Mayor Sugenoya is a medical doctor who used to work on thyroid cancer treatment in Belarus after the Chernobyl accident. This and other similar cases influenced parents of all regions, and parents groups to address school lunch issue were formed everywhere. Those independent groups have also made a network called National Network of Parents to Protect Children from Radiation, in which over 300 groups are currently listed. Each group has been acting to reduce children's risk from school lunch, such as use of produce from Western Japan, monitoring of ingredients, disclosure of monitoring results, stricter standards than national government, eliminating high-risk ingredients, and so forth. Some have succeeded, some are still fighting. Especially in June 2011, municipalities in Fukushima announced that they would stick to local production, local consumption principle in school lunch by claiming that people in Fukushima had to fight against Fusho Higai again. By they themselves eat produce Fukushima, by they themselves have to eat produces of Fukushima to prove people in other regions that Fukushima produces are okay. It was problematized by one author in a national TV program and became huge controversy. Despite of strong requests from parents and of nationwide criticism, according to the report, Fukushima municipality is still promoting local production, local consumption, and have not fully addressed to the concerns. Citizens groups brought a case demanding a collective evacuation from Fukushima, and school lunch problems was produced as one of evidences. In April this year, Sendai High Court ruled against citizens, and they are now preparing to file an appeal. These consumers' activism led to the revision of governmental standards of April 1st, 2012, about a year later from Fukushima tragedy. Comparing to provisional standards, the limits were lowered significantly. For drinking water, from 200 to 10, for milk, from 200 to 50, for general foods, from 500 to 100. New standards also set the limit specifically for infant foods as 50. We cannot still say 100 becquerel is safe, but this significant reduction of accepted contamination level was definitely achievement of consumers' activism. And it is not only consumers who are fighting. In December 2011, Fukushima rice farmers sued TEPCO, demanding compensation for their field damage and Fusho Higai. In September 2012, co-op grocery stores sued TEPCO, demanding compensation for their loss by Fusho Higai. In 2013, an organic vegetable delivery company in Chiba and a steakhouse chain whose business had been heavily relying on ingredients from East Japan both sued TEPCO, demanding compensation for their loss by Fusho Higai. Last month, At the mass negotiation between TEPCO, the government, and Fukushima farmers, they raised their voices. It is not Fusho Higai. It is real. So gradually, people come to speak out about the deception of Fusho Higai argument and start fighting. So this is eating and living in post-Fukushima, post-nuclear accident world. Safe food is not given anymore. You have to keep fighting for your right to eat safe foods. At the same time, after 2 years passed, people seem to get tired. It is a long, exhausting fight. Last December 2012, the Liberal Democratic Party, who is promoting nuclear power, still now, after all of this, won lower house election by landslide. In this month, there will be upper house election, and the Liberal Democratic Party is expected to take a majority. People started to give in the endless, frustrating struggles. They gradually accept radiation contamination of food and start to think about if by any chance they would be able to coexist with contamination. But we have to keep thinking about children. Food cell division is so active, thus so vulnerable to radiation exposure. They have to keep eating and growing in post-Fukushima world. We have to make a system as better as possible so that they don't have to eat food filled with invisible red dots, with believing it is safe. As an ending remark, I would like to tell you this. Nuclear power is by no means a clean energy. Climate change is serious, and I strongly believe that we need to reduce coal and oil consumptions. I do. But please do not consider nuclear power as an alternative solution. If you did, please remember my talk today. How devastating, grueling, pathetic the world will be. Please, instead, think about natural energy, renewable energy. But most importantly, please think about saving energy. Why do we need a sweater to study in a library in the middle of summer? So this room is great. Thank you very much.
And we have time for a few questions for Aiko Kojima.
That was a great talk. I learned a lot. So I want to say thank you. And this may sound like a really trivial question, but a lot of people use microwaves. So wouldn't that still be considered the same as the radioactivity in the food in Fukushima? Like using a microwave also damages a person, even though it's convenient. I mean, standing in front of it affects your body as well. And it's interesting, like how different, even though it may be a different source, it still exists in the United States as well with GMOs or like Monsanto taking over food, and we don't have reoccurring seeds and all of that stuff. It's going on in different places, but back to my original question, aren't microwaves just as harmful as the radioactive food?
Is there a science teacher here? Can you?
The answer is no. Sorry. Microwaves are like heat radiation and not radioactivity. So there's no radioactivity in your microwave. And besides that, the US government keeps tabs on these things, not perfectly, but I think in that case you're safe.
about the healthcare system? Looking down the road, people are going to need surgeries, other kinds of treatments for cancer. What is being talked about and put in place now for that future?
So for people in Fukushima, the health checks, the total whole population in Fukushima has to take the health check, and they keep tracking the records, but they're not very helpful. And those test results, the reading of those test results are also sometimes biased by doctors and scientists. For example, I think it's 50% of children? 48? Yeah. So children in Fukushima, 50% of them have some abnormalities in their thyroid. Now it was found. But how to report that number, you can use the word trick. I mean, it can be, the serious case was just one, or although there are some minor abnormalities were found, they're not very serious, or those way to deal with. So that medical support is also the big issues, and it is the center of activism, of course. And for that, like Dr. Hida or those conscious doctors are supporting in those activism. And is there any?
And also that Chernobyl is used in various ways, and particularly with the thyroid abnormalities and with the death of Mr. Yoshida that Yuki Miyamoto talked about yesterday, the plant manager at the time of the disaster. The refrain you will hear repeatedly is, this has nothing to do with the Fukushima disaster because it's showing up too early. Like in Chernobyl, thyroid abnormalities only showed up 5 years later. Well, from what I've read, thyroid abnormalities were showing up from early, a year and two later. In Chernobyl, they peaked in around year 5, but that doesn't mean they weren't showing up. But repeatedly you will hear experts say, this has nothing to do with the Fukushima disaster because it's too soon. Then one begs that begs the question, well, why are 48% of children showing up with thyroid abnormalities? But
you put up a image or chart of the effect of radiation on different parts of the body, and I noticed it was a female body, and I was wondering about the reproductive effects on males versus females, and if just thinking about inequality and yeah, I was just wondering.
Yeah, it is reported that females are more vulnerable than males, and so that is why radiation workers. So each government has a limit of exposure for general citizens and radiation workers, and among the but not in the U.S., right? Not in the U.S. But in Japan, there's a different standards even for radiation workers, for women and men, because the vulnerability is different. But I think we talked that it doesn't.
Except that the year 7, the biological effects of ionizing radiation, number 7 of the National Academy of Sciences does have a statement that's hidden well in the long report that women are 50% more vulnerable. But I don't think it translates into standards, though.
This might not be something you can answer, but I know that there are a lot of children who were orphaned after the earthquake and tsunami, and you mentioned in your talk how important the role of parent groups were in advocating for students changing the school lunches. And I was wondering if the children who are now orphaned or without parents also have advocates, like, you know, if there are groups that are working to make sure that those students also have access to food that's as safe as possible.
I'm not following the match cases about orphans, so I don't know very well, but yes, I'm sorry, but there are the group of peoples who are trying to make children evacuate, or at least, if not permanently, but temporarily, using the summer vacation, because it is, so this is also the knowledge from Chernobyl. If you could stay in the radiation-free environment for a month or few months, your internal radiation level gets significantly lowered. So even if you have to keep living in that contaminated area, that occasional, the temporary evacuation will be very meaningful. So there's a lot of citizens groups are inviting their camps or field or the homestays and those things, and there are many citizen groups who are working on it.
In the second slide, you showed tanks of radioactive water, and one of the things that was
This?
no, it was like tanks of water in storage tanks.
Storage of water.
And what I didn't get was the scale.
Tiny.
How large are those tanks?
No.
Or was there a truck or something there that would? It was in the beginning.
Number 4? Oh, this one. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. What was the question?
Is there anything to say? What's the scale?
Oh.
How large?
So this is a people. This is a human. So the tank is this huge. Do you see? This is the tank, but human, I think the adult male is this size. In now, 100 million gallons are there, and every day 100,000 gallons increasing. But they will filter it, but it's too much. But even if they filter it, the filter got radioactive, so they have to deal with it. So it's an endless process to go up.
Let us thank Aiko Kojima.